Esther's full name was Estepan Yalo. Rahel's was Rahel. For the time being, they had no surname, because Amu was considering reverting to her maiden name, though she said that choosing between her husband's name and her father's name didn't give a woman much of a choice. Esther was wearing his beige and pointy shoes and his Elvis puff, his special outing puff. Esther had slanting, sleepy eyes, and his new front teeth were still uneven on the ends. Rahel's new teeth were waiting inside her gums, like words in a pen. It puzzled everybody that an 18-minute age difference could cause such a discrepancy in front tooth timing. Most of Rahel's hair sat on the top of her head like a fountain. It was held together by a love in Tokyo, 2 beads on a rubber band, nothing to do with love or Tokyo. In Kerala, love in Tokyos have withstood the test of time, and even today if you were to ask for one at any respectable A1 ladies' store, that's what you'd get, 2 beads on a rubber band. Rahel's toy wristwatch had the time painted on it, 10 to 2. One of her ambitions was to own a watch in which she could change the time whenever she wanted to, which according to her was what time was meant for in the first place. Her yellow-rimmed red plastic sunglasses made the world look red. Amu said they were bad for her eyes and had advised her to wear them as seldom as possible. Her airport frock was in Amu's suitcase. It had special matching knickers. Chako was driving. He was 4 years older than Amu. Chako's room was stacked from floor to ceiling with books. He had read them all and quoted long passages from them for no apparent reason, or at least none that anyone else could fathom. For instance, that morning, as they drove out through the gate, shouting their goodbyes to Papachi in the veranda, Chako suddenly said, "Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams, that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men." Everyone was so used to it that they didn't bother to nudge each other or exchange glances. Chako had been a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, and was permitted excesses and eccentricities nobody else was. He claimed to be writing a family biography that the family would have to pay him not to publish. Amu said there was only one person in the family who was a fit candidate for biographical blackmail, and that was Chako himself. Of course, that was then, before the terror. In the Plymouth, Amu was sitting in front, next to Chako. She was 27 that year, and in the pit of her stomach she carried the cold knowledge that for her, life had been lived. She had had one chance. She made a mistake. She married the wrong man. Amu finished her schooling the same year that her father retired from his job in Delhi and moved to Yemenam. Papachi insisted that a college education was an unnecessary expense for a girl, so Amu had no choice but to leave Delhi and move with them. There was very little for a young girl to do in Yemenam, other than to wait for marriage proposals while she helped her mother with the housework. Amu grew desperate. All day she dreamed of escaping from Yemenam and the clutches of her ill-tempered father and bitter, long-suffering mother. She hatched several wretched little plans. Eventually, one worked. Papachi agreed to let her spend the summer with a distant aunt who lived in Calcutta. There, at someone else's wedding reception, Amu met her future husband. He was on vacation from his job in Assam, where he worked as an assistant manager of a tea estate. He was a small man, but well-built. He was 25 and had already been working on the tea estates for 6 years. He proposed to Amu 5 days after they first met. Amu didn't pretend to be in love with him. She just weighed the odds and accepted. She thought that anything, anyone at all, would be better than returning to Yemenam. She wrote to her parents informing them of her decision. They didn't reply. Amu had an elaborate Calcutta wedding. Later, looking back on the day, Amu realized that the slightly feverish glitter in her bridegroom's eyes had not been love, or even excitement at the prospect of carnal bliss, but approximately 8 large pegs of whiskey. When Amu and her husband moved to Assam, Amu, beautiful, young and cheeky, became the toast of the Planters' Club. She wore backless blouses with her saris and carried a silver lame purse on a chain. Her husband turned out not to be just a heavy drinker, but a full-blown alcoholic, with all an alcoholic's deviousness and tragic charm. Amu was 8 months pregnant when war broke out with China. It was October of 1962. Planters' wives and children were evacuated from Assam. Amu, too pregnant to travel, remained on the estate. In November, after a hair-raising, bumpy bus ride to Shillong, amidst rumors of Chinese occupation and India's impending defeat, Esther and Rahel were born. 2 little ones instead of 1 big one. Amu checked them for deformities before she closed her eyes and slept. She didn't notice the single Siamese soul. By the time the twins were 2 years old, their father's drinking, aggravated by the loneliness of tea estate life, had driven him into an alcoholic stupor. Eventually, his English manager, Mr. Hollick, summoned him to his bungalow for a serious chat. Amu sat in the veranda of her home waiting anxiously for her husband to return. She was surprised when he returned looking despondent but not devastated. Mr. Hollick had proposed something, he told Amu, that he needed to discuss with her. Viewed practically, in the long run it was a proposition that would benefit both of them, he said. Mr. Hollick had been frank with his young assistant. "I'm afraid I have no option," he said, "but to ask for your resignation." He allowed the pitiful man sitting across the table to begin to shake, to weep. Then Hollick spoke again. "Well, actually there may be an option. Perhaps we could work something out. You're a very lucky man, you know. Wonderful family, beautiful children, such an attractive wife." He lit a cigarette and allowed the match to burn until he couldn't hold it any more. An extremely attractive wife. Over coffee, Mr. Hollick proposed that Baba go away for a while, for a holiday, to a clinic perhaps, for treatment. And for the period of time that he was away, Mr. Hollick suggested that Amu be sent to his bungalow to be looked after. Amu watched her husband's mouth move as it formed words. She said nothing. He grew uncomfortable and then infuriated by her silence. Suddenly he lunged at her, grabbed her hair, punched her hard, and then passed out from the effort. Amu took down the heaviest book she could find in the bookshelf, the Reader's Digest World Atlas, and hit him with it as hard as she could, on his head, his legs, his back and shoulders. When he regained consciousness, he was puzzled by his bruises. When his bouts of violence began to include the children, and the war with Pakistan began, Amu left her husband and returned, unwelcomed, to her parents in Yemenam, to everything that she had fled from only a few years ago, except that now she had 2 young children and no more dreams. Papachi would not believe her story, not because he thought well of her husband, but simply because he didn't believe that an Englishman, any Englishman, would covet another man's wife. Amu loved her children, of course, but their wide-eyed vulnerability and their willingness to love people who didn't really love them exasperated her and sometimes made her want to hurt them, just as an education, a protection. To Amu, her twins seemed like a pair of small, bewildered frogs engrossed in each other's company, lolloping arm in arm down a highway full of hurtling traffic, entirely oblivious of what trucks can do to frogs. Amu watched over them fiercely. She was quick to reprimand the children, but even quicker to take offense on their behalf. For herself, she knew there would be no more chances. There was only Yemenam now. And in the background, the constant high whining mule of local disapproval. When she looked at herself in her wedding photographs, Amu felt that the woman that looked back at her was someone else, a foolish, jeweled bride. Looking at herself like this, Amu's soft mouth would twist into a small, bitter smile at the memory, not of the wedding itself, so much as the fact that she had permitted herself to be so painstakingly decorated before being led to the gallows. It seemed so absurd. She went to the village goldsmith and had her heavy wedding ring melted down and made into a thin bangle with snake heads that she put away for Rahel. Occasionally, when Amu listened to songs that she loved on the radio, something stirred inside her. A liquid ache spread under her skin, and she walked out of the world like a witch, to a better, happier place. On days like this, there was something restless and untamed about her, as though she had temporarily set aside the morality of motherhood and divorceehood. Even her walk changed from a safe mother walk to another, wilder sort of walk. She spent hours on the riverbank with her little plastic transistor shaped like a tangerine. She smoked cigarettes and had midnight swims. What was it that gave Amu this unsafe edge, this air of unpredictability? It was what she had battling inside her, an unmixable mix, this infinite tenderness of motherhood and the reckless rage of a suicide bomber. It was this that grew inside her, and eventually led her to love by night the man her children loved by day, to use by night the boat that her children used by day, the boat that Esther sat on and Rahel found. On the days that the radio played Amu's songs, everyone was a little wary of her. They sensed somehow that she lived in the penumbral shadows between two worlds, just beyond the grasp of their power. So on the days that the radio played Amu's songs, people avoided her, made little loops around her, because everybody agreed that it was best to just let her be. On other days, she had deep dimples when she smiled. On that sky-blue December day, her wild, curly hair had escaped in wisps in the car wind. Her shoulders in her sleeveless sari blouse shone as though they had been polished with high-wax shoulder polish. Sometimes she was the most beautiful woman that Esther and Rahel had ever seen, and sometimes she wasn't. On the back seat of the Plymouth, between Esther and Rahel, sat baby Kochamma, ex-nun and incumbent baby grand-aunt. In the way that the unfortunate sometimes dislike the co-unfortunate, baby Kochamma disliked the twins, for she considered them doomed, fatherless waifs. Worse still, they were half Hindu hybrids, whom no self-respecting Syrian Christian would ever marry. She was keen for them to realize that they, like herself, lived on sufferance in the Ayemanem house, their maternal grandmother's house, where they really had no right to be. Baby Kochamma resented Amu because she saw her quarreling with a fate that she, baby Kochamma herself, felt she had graciously accepted, the fate of the wretched manless woman. She subscribed wholeheartedly to the commonly held view that a married daughter had no position in her parents' home. As for a divorced daughter, according to baby Kochamma, she had no position anywhere at all. And as for a divorced daughter from a love marriage, well, words could not describe baby Kochamma's outrage. As for a divorced daughter from an intercommunity love marriage, baby Kochamma chose to remain quiveringly silent on the subject. On the way back from the airport, Margaret Kochamma would sit in front with Chako because she used to be his wife. Sophie Mole would sit between them. Amu would move to the back. On the Plymouth roof rack, there was a four-sided, tin-lined plywood billboard that said, on all four sides, in elaborate writing, "Paradise Pickles and Preserves." Below the writing, there were painted bottles of mixed fruit jam and hot lime pickle in edible oil, with labels that said, in elaborate writing, "Paradise Pickles and Preserves." Amu said that the billboard made them look ridiculous, like a traveling circus, with tail fins. Papachi had started making pickles commercially soon after Papachi retired from government service in Delhi and came to live in Ayemanem. The Kottayam Bible Society was having a fair and asked Papachi to make some of her famous banana jam and tender mango pickle. It sold quickly, and Papachi found that she had more orders than she could cope with. Thrilled with her success, she decided to persist with pickles and jams and soon found herself busy all year round. Though Papachi had conical corneas and was already practically blind, Papachi would not help her with the pickle-making because he did not consider pickle-making a suitable job for a high-ranking ex-government official. He'd always been a jealous man, so he greatly resented the attention his wife was suddenly getting. Every night he beat her with a brass flower vase. The beatings weren't new. Then Chako came home for a summer vacation from Oxford. He had grown to be a big man, and was in those days strong from rowing for Balliol. A week after he arrived, he found Papachi beating Mamachi in the study. Chako strode into the room, caught Papachi's vase hand, and twisted it around his back. "I never want this to happen again," he told his father. "Ever." For the rest of the day, Papachi sat in the veranda and stared stonily out at the ornamental garden, ignoring the plates of food that Kochamma brought him. Late at night, he went into his study and brought out his favorite mahogany rocking chair. He put it down in the middle of the driveway and smashed it into little bits with a plumber's monkey wrench. He left it there in the moonlight, a heap of varnished wicker and splintered wood. He never touched Mamachi again, but he never spoke to her either as long as he lived. He bought the sky-blue Plymouth from an old Englishman in Munnar. He became a familiar sight in Yemenam, coasting importantly down the narrow road in his wide car. He wouldn't allow Mamachi or anyone else in the family to use it, or even to sit in it. The Plymouth was Papachi's revenge. Papachi had been an imperial entomologist at the Pusa Institute. After independence, when the British left, his designation was changed from imperial entomologist to joint director, entomology. His life's greatest setback was not having had the moth that he had discovered named after him. It fell into his drink one evening while he was sitting in the veranda of a rest house after a long day in the field. As he picked it out, he noticed its unusually dense dorsal tufts. He took a closer look. With growing excitement he mounted it, measured it, and the next morning placed it in the sun for a few hours for the alcohol to evaporate. Then he caught the first train back to Delhi, to taxonomic attention and, he hoped, fame. After 6 unbearable months of anxiety, to Papachi's intense disappointment, he was told that his moth had finally been identified as a slightly unusual race of a well-known species that belonged to the tropical family Limantridae. The real blow came 12 years later, when, as a consequence of a radical taxonomic reshuffle, lepidopterists decided that Papachi's moth was, in fact, a separate species and genus hitherto unknown to science. By then, of course, Papachi had retired and moved to Yemenam. It was too late for him to assert his claim to the discovery. His moth was named after the acting director of the Department of Entomology, a junior officer whom Papachi had always disliked. In the years to come, even though he had been ill-humored long before he discovered the moth, Papachi's moth was held responsible for his black moods and sudden bouts of temper. Its pernicious ghost-gray, furry, and with unusually dense dorsal tufts haunted every house that he ever lived in. It tormented him, and his children, and his children's children. Until the day he died, even in the stifling Yemenam heat, every single day Papachi wore a well-pressed 3-piece suit and his gold pocket watch. On his dressing table, next to his cologne and silver hairbrush, he kept a picture of himself as a young man, with his hair slicked down, taken in a photographer's studio in Vienna, where he had done the 6-month diploma course that had qualified him to apply for the post of imperial entomologist. It was during those few months they spent in Vienna that Mamachi took her first lessons on the violin. The lessons were abruptly discontinued when Mamachi's teacher made the mistake of telling Papachi that his wife was exceptionally talented and, in his opinion, potentially concert class. At Papachi's funeral, Mamachi cried, and her contact lenses slid around in her eyes. Amu told the twins that Mamachi was crying more because she was used to him than because she loved him. The photograph of Papachi in Vienna with his hair slicked down was reframed and put up in the drawing room. His light brown eyes were polite yet maleficent, as though he were making an effort to be civil to the photographer while plotting to murder his wife. There was a watchful stillness to the photograph that lent an underlying chill to the warm room in which it hung. Amu said that Papachi was an incurable British CCP, which was short for chichipoch, and in Hindi meant shit-wiper. Chako said that the correct word for people like Papachi was anglophile. He made Rahel and Esther look up anglophile in the Reader's Digest's great encyclopedic dictionary. It said, person well disposed to the English. Then Esther and Rahel had to look up dispose. It said, 1. Place suitably in particular order. 2. Bring mind into certain state. 3. Do what one will with. Get off one's hands. Stow away. Demolish. Finish. Settle. Consume. Food. Kill. Sell. Chako said that in Papachi's case it meant to bring mind into certain state, which, Chako said, meant that Papachi's mind had been brought into a state which made him like the English. Chako told the twins that, though he hated to admit it, they were all Anglophiles. They were a family of Anglophiles, pointed in the wrong direction, trapped outside their own history, and unable to retrace their steps because their footprints had been swept away. He explained to them that history was like an old house at night, with all the lamps lit, and ancestors whispering inside. To understand history, Chako said, we have to go inside and listen to what they're saying, and look at the books and the pictures on the wall, and smell the smells. Esther and Rahel had no doubt that the house Chako meant was the house on the other side of the river, in the middle of the abandoned rubber estate where they had never been. Kari Saipa's house, the Black Sahib, the Englishman who had gone native. A Yemenem's own Kurtz, a Yemenem, his private heart of darkness. He had shot himself through the head 10 years ago, when his young lover's parents had taken the boy away from him and sent him to school. After the suicide, the property had become the subject of extensive litigation between Kari Saipa's cook and his secretary. The house had lain empty for years. Very few people had seen it, but the twins could picture it. The history house, with cool stone floors and dim walls and billowing ship-shaped shadows. Plump, translucent lizards lived behind old pictures, and waxy, crumbling ancestors with tough toenails and breath that smelled of yellow maps gossiped in sibilant, papery whispers. But we can't go in, Chako explained, because we've been locked out, and when we look in through the windows, all we see are shadows, and when we try and listen, all we hear is a whispering. And we cannot understand the whispering, because our minds have been invaded by a war that we have won and lost, the very worst sort of war, a war that captures dreams and redreams them, a war that has made us adore our conquerors and despise ourselves. Marry our conquerors is more like it, Amu said dryly, referring to Margaret Kochamma. Chako ignored her. He made the twins look up despise. It said, to look down upon, to view with contempt, to scorn or disdain. Chako said that in the context of the war he was talking about, the war of dreams, despise meant all those things. We're prisoners of war, Chako said. Our dreams have been doctored. We belong nowhere. We sail unanchored on troubled seas. We may never be allowed ashore. Our sorrows will never be sad enough. Our joys never happy enough. Our dreams never big enough. Our lives never important enough to matter. Then, to give Esther and Rahel a sense of historical perspective, though perspective was something which, in the weeks to follow, Chako himself would sorely lack, he told them about the Earth Woman. He made them imagine that the Earth, 4,600 million years ago, was a 46-year-old woman, as old, say, as Alayama teacher, who gave them Malayalam lessons. It had taken the whole of Earth Woman's life for the Earth to become what it was. The Earth Woman was 11 years old, Chako said, when the first single-celled organisms appeared. The first animals, creatures like worms and jellyfish, appeared only when she was 40. The whole of human civilization as we know it, Chako told the twins, began only 2 hours ago in the Earth Woman's life. As long as it takes us to drive from Yemenem to Cochin. It was an awe-inspiring and humbling thought, Chako said, that the whole of contemporary history, the world wars, the war of dreams, the man on the moon, science, literature, philosophy, the pursuit of knowledge, was no more than a blink of the Earth Woman's eye. And we, my dears, everything we are and ever will be, are just a twinkle in her eye, Chako said grandly, lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling. When he was in this sort of mood, Chako used his reading aloud voice. He didn't care whether anyone was listening to him or not, and if they were, he didn't care whether or not they had understood what he was saying. Later, in the light of all that happened, twinkle seemed completely the wrong word to describe the expression in the Earth Woman's eye. Though the Earth Woman made a lasting impression on the twins, it was the History House, so much closer at hand, that really fascinated them. Looming in the heart of darkness, a house they couldn't enter, full of whispers they couldn't understand. They didn't know then that soon they would go in, that they would cross the river and be where they weren't supposed to be, with a man they weren't supposed to love, that they would watch with dinner plate eyes as history revealed itself to them in the back veranda. While other children of their age learned other things, Esther and Rahel learned how history negotiates its terms and collects its dues from those who break its laws. They heard its sickening thud. They smelled its smell and never forgot it. History's smell, like old roses on a breeze. It would lurk forever in ordinary things, in coat hangers, tomatoes, in the tar on roads, in certain colors, in the plates at a restaurant, in the absence of words, and the emptiness in eyes. They would grow up grappling with ways of living with what happened. They would try to tell themselves that in terms of geological time, it was an insignificant event, just a blink of the Earth Woman's eye. That worse things had happened. That worse things kept happening. But they would find no comfort in the thought. Chako said that going to see The Sound of Music was an extended exercise in anglophilia. Amu said, "Oh, come on, the whole world goes to see The Sound of Music. It's a world hit." "Nevertheless, my dear," Chako said in his reading aloud voice. Never the less. It was only after Papachi died that Chako resigned his job as lecturer at the Madras Christian College and came to Yemenem with his Balial ore and his pickle barren dreams. He commuted his pension and provident fund to buy a Bharat bottle sealing machine. His ore, with his teammates' names inscribed in gold, hung from iron hoops on the factory wall. Up to the time Chako arrived, the factory had been a small but profitable enterprise. Mamachi just ran it like a large kitchen. Chako had it registered as a partnership and informed Mamachi that she was the sleeping partner. Almost immediately, the financial slide began, but was artificially buoyed by extravagant bank loans that Chako raised by mortgaging the family's rice fields around the Yemenem house. Though Amu did as much work in the factory as Chako, whenever he was dealing with food inspectors or sanitary engineers, he always referred to it as my factory, my pineapples, my pickles. Legally, this was the case, because Amu, as a daughter, had no claim to the property. Chako told Rahel and Esther that Amu had no locus standi. "Thanks to our wonderful male chauvinist society," Amu said. Chako said, "What's yours is mine, and what's mine is also mine." It was Chako who christened the factory Paradise Pickles and Preserves, and had labels designed and printed at Comrade K&M Pilla's Press. It was Chako's idea to have a billboard painted and installed on the Plymouth's roof rack. Now, on the way to Cochin, it rattled and made falling-off noises. Near Vicom, they had to stop and buy some rope to secure it more firmly. That delayed them by another 20 minutes. Rahel began to worry about being late for the sound of music. Then, as they approached the outskirts of Cochin, the red and white arm of the railway level crossing gate went down. The twins were precocious with their reading. They had raced through Old Dog Tom, Janet and John, and their Ronald Ridout workbooks. At night, Amu read to them from Kipling's Jungle Book. Now chill the kite brings home the night, that Mang the bat sets free. As she read, Amu could make her voice gravelly, like Shere Khan's, or whining, like Tabaki's. Ye choose, and ye do not choose. What talk is this of choosing? By the bull that I killed, am I to stand nosing in your dog's den for my fair dues? It is I, Shere Khan, who speak. And it is I, Raksha, who answer, the twins would shout in high voices, not together, but almost. Baby Kochamma, who had been put in charge of their formal education, had read them an abridged version of The Tempest by Charles and Mary Lamb. Where the bee sucks, there suck I, Esther and Rahel would go about saying. In a cowslip's bell I lie. More buses and cars had stopped on either side of the level crossing. The buses all had girls' names. Lucy Kuti, Muli Kuti, Bina Mol. In Malayalam, Mol is little girl and Mon is little boy. Initially, when the level crossing had just closed, the air was full of the impatient sound of idling engines. But when the man that manned the crossing came out of his booth, on his backwards bending legs, and signaled with his limp, flapping walk to the tea stall that they were in for a long wait, drivers switched off their engines and milled about, stretching their legs. Inside the Plymouth, it wasn't easy for Rahel to see Esther, because baby Kochamma rose between them like a hill. Amu had insisted that they sit separately to prevent them from fighting. When they fought, Esther called Rahel a refugee stick insect. Rahel called him Elvis the Pelvis and did a twisty, funny kind of dance that infuriated Esther. Baby Kochamma was holding on to the back of the front seat with her arms. When the car moved, her arm fat swung like heavy washing in the wind. Now it hung down like a fleshy curtain, blocking Esther from Rahel. Then, from a distance, a hum approached the held-up traffic and covered it like a cloak. The drivers who'd been stretching their legs got back into their vehicles and slammed their doors. The beggars and vendors disappeared. Within minutes, there was no one on the road. From behind the line of waiting, oncoming traffic, a column of men appeared, with red flags and banners and a hum that grew and grew. "Put up your windows," Chako said, "and stay calm. They're not going to hurt us." "Why not join them, comrade?" Amu said to Chako. "I'll drive." Chako said nothing, a muscle tense below the wad of fat on his jaw. He tossed away his cigarette and rolled up his window. Chako was a self-proclaimed Marxist. He would call pretty women who worked in the factory to his room, and on the pretext of lecturing them on labor rights and trade union law, flirt with them outrageously. Amu said it was all hogwash, an Oxford avatar of the old zamindar mentality, a landlord forcing his attentions on women who depended on him for their livelihood. Suddenly, the sky-blue Plymouth looked absurdly opulent on the narrow-pitted road, like a wide lady squeezing down a narrow corridor, like baby Kochamma in church, on her way to the bread and wine. "Look down," baby Kochamma said, as the front ranks of the procession approached the car. "Avoid eye contact. That's what really provokes them." Within minutes, the road was swamped by thousands of marching people, automobile islands in a river of people. The air was red with flags, which dipped and lifted as the marchers ducked under the level crossing gate and swept across the railway tracks in a red wave. "Long live the revolution," they shouted. "Workers of the world unite." Though Chako was not a card-holding member of the party, he had been converted early and had remained, through all its travails, a committed supporter. He was an undergraduate at Delhi University during the euphoria of 1957, when the Communists won the state assembly elections, and Nehru invited them to form a government. Chako's hero, Comrade E.M.S. Nambudripad, the flamboyant Brahmin high priest of Marxism in Kerala, became chief minister of the first ever democratically elected communist government in the world. Suddenly, the communists found themselves in the extraordinary, critics said absurd, position of having to govern a people and foment revolution simultaneously. Comrade E.M.S. Nambudripad evolved his own theory about how he would do this. Chako studied his treatise on the peaceful transition to communism with an adolescent's obsessive diligence and an ardent fan's unquestioning approval. It set out in detail how Comrade E.M.S. Nambudripad's government intended to enforce land reforms, neutralize the police, subvert the judiciary, and restrain the hand of the reactionary anti-people Congress government at the center. Unfortunately, before the year was out, the peaceful part of the peaceful transition came to an end. Every morning at breakfast, the imperial entomologist derided his argumentative Marxist son by reading out newspaper reports of the riots, strikes, and incidents of police brutality that convulsed Kerala. "So, Karl Marx," Papachi would sneer when Chako came to the table. "What shall we do with these bloody students now? The stupid goons are agitating against our people's government. Shall we annihilate them? Surely students aren't people anymore." Over the next 2 years, the political discord, fueled by the Congress Party and the Church, slid into anarchy. By the time Chako finished his B.A. and left for Oxford to do another one, Kerala was on the brink of civil war. Nehru dismissed the communist government and announced fresh elections. The Congress Party returned to power. It was only in 1967, almost exactly 10 years after they first came to power, that Comrade E.M.S. Nambudripad's party was re-elected, this time as part of a coalition between what had by now become two separate parties, the Communist Party of India and the Communist Party of India, Marxist, the CPI and the CPI-M. Papachi was dead by then, Chako divorced, Paradise Pickles was 7 years old. Kerala was reeling in the aftermath of famine and a failed monsoon. People were dying. Hunger had to be very high up on any government list of priorities. During his second term in office, Comrade E.M.S. went about implementing the peaceful transition more soberly. This earned him the wrath of the Chinese Communist Party. They denounced him for his parliamentary cretinism and accused him of providing relief to the people and thereby blunting the people's consciousness and diverting them from the revolution. Peking switched its patronage to the newest, most militant faction of the CPI-M, the Naxalites, who had staged an armed insurrection at Naxalbari, a village in Bengal. They organized peasants into fighting cadres, seized land, expelled the owners, and established people's courts to try class enemies. The Naxalite movement spread across the country and struck terror in every bourgeois heart. In Kerala, they breathed the plume of excitement and fear into the already frightened air. Killings had begun in the north. Comrade E.M.S. Nambudripad, running dog, Soviet stooge, expelled the Naxalites from his party and went on with the business of harnessing anger for parliamentary purposes. The march that surged around the sky-blue Plymouth on that sky-blue December day was a part of that process. It had been organized by the Travancore Cochin Marxist Labor Union. Their comrades in Trivandrum would march to the Secretariat and present the Charter of People's Demands to Comrade E.M.S. himself, the orchestra petitioning its conductor. The marchers that day were party workers, students, and laborers themselves. There was an edge to this anger that was Naxalite and new. Through the Plymouth window, Rahel could see that the loudest word they said was Zindabad, and that the veins stood out in their necks when they said it, and that the arms that held the flags and banners were knotted and hard. Inside the Plymouth, it was still and hot. Baby Kochamma's fear lay rolled up on the car floor like a damp, clammy cheroot. This was just the beginning of it. the fear that over the years would grow to consume her, that would make her lock her doors and windows. Hers, too, was an ancient, age-old fear, the fear of being dispossessed. Just then Rahel saw Velutha, Velya Papan's son, Velutha, her most beloved friend Velutha. Velutha marching with a red flag, in a white shirt and mundu with angry veins in his neck. He never usually wore a shirt. Rahel rolled down her window in a flash. "Velutha, Velutha!" she called to him. He stepped sideways and disappeared deftly into the angriness around him. Inside the car, Amu whirled around, and her eyes were angry. She slapped at Rahel's calves, which were the only part of her left in the car to slap. "Behave yourself," Amu said. Baby Kochamma pulled Rahel down, and she landed on the seat with a surprised thump. "It was Velutha," she explained with a smile, "and he had a flag." The flag had seemed to her a most impressive piece of equipment, the right thing for a friend to have. "You're a stupid, silly little girl," Amu said. Rahel saw that Amu had a film of perspiration on her forehead and upper lip, and that her eyes had become hard like marbles. Like Papachi's in the Vienna studio photograph, how Papachi's moth whispered in his children's veins. Baby Kochamma rolled up Rahel's window. It was Velutha. That much Rahel was sure of. She'd seen him. He'd seen her. She'd have known him anywhere, any time. And if he hadn't been wearing a shirt, she would have recognized him from behind. She knew his back. She'd been carried on it, more times than she could count. It had a light brown birthmark, shaped like a pointed dry leaf. He said it was a lucky leaf that made the monsoons come on time. A brown leaf on a black back, an autumn leaf at night. A lucky leaf that wasn't lucky enough. Velutha wasn't supposed to be a carpenter. He was called Velutha, which means white in Malayalam, because he was so black. His father, Velya Papan, was a paravan. He had a glass eye. He had been shaping a block of granite with a hammer when a chip flew into his left eye and sliced right through it. As a young boy, Velutha would come with Velya Papan to the back entrance of the Yemenam house to deliver the coconuts that they had plucked from the trees in the compound. Papachi would not allow paravans into the house. Nobody would. They were not allowed to touch anything that touchables touched. Mamachi told Esther and Rahel that she could remember a time in her girlhood when paravans were expected to crawl backwards with a broom, sweeping away their footprints so that Brahmins or Syrian Christians would not defile themselves by accidentally stepping into a paravan's footprint. It was Mamachi, on vacation from Delhi and imperial entomology, who first noticed little Velutha's remarkable facility with his hands. Velutha was 11 then, about 3 years younger than Amu. He could make intricate toys, tiny windmills, rattles, minute jewel boxes out of dried palm reeds. He could carve perfect boats out of tapioca stems and figurines on cashew nuts. He would bring them for Amu, holding them out in his palm, as he had been taught, so that she wouldn't have to touch him to take them. Mamachi persuaded Velya Papan to send him to the Untouchable school that her father-in-law Punyan Kunyu had founded. Apart from his carpentry skills, Velutha had a way with machines. Mamachi, with impenetrable touchable logic, often said that if only he hadn't been a paravan, he might have become an engineer. He mended radios, clocks, water pumps. He looked after the plumbing and all the electrical gadgets in the house. Velutha knew more about the machines in the factory than anyone else. When Chako resigned his job in Madras and returned to Yemenam with a Bharat bottle sealing machine, it was Velutha who reassembled it and set it up. It was Velutha who maintained the new canning machine and the automatic pineapple slicer. Velutha's father, Velya Papan, however, was an old-world paravan. He had seen the crawling backwards days, and his gratitude to Mamachi and her family for all that they had done for him was as wide and deep as a river in spate. When he had his accident with the stone chip, Mamachi organized and paid for his glass eye. He hadn't worked off his debt yet, and though he knew he wasn't expected to, that he wouldn't ever be able to, he felt that his eye was not his own. His gratitude widened his smile and bent his back. Velya Papan feared for his younger son. He couldn't say what it was that frightened him. It was nothing that he had said or done. Velutha tried to caution Velutha, but since he couldn't put his finger on what it was that bothered him, Velutha misunderstood his muddled concern. Velutha's good intentions quickly degenerated into nagging and bickering and a general air of unpleasantness between father and son. Much to his mother's dismay, Velutha began to avoid going home. Then one day he disappeared. For 4 years nobody knew where he was. There was no way of reaching him when his mother, Cella, died of tuberculosis. Then Kutapen, his older brother, fell off a coconut tree and damaged his spine. Velutha heard of the accident a whole year after it happened. It had been 5 months since he returned to Ayamenem. Papachi rehired Velutha as the factory carpenter and put him in charge of general maintenance. It caused a great deal of resentment among the other touchable factory workers because, according to them, paravans were not meant to be carpenters, and certainly prodigal paravans were not meant to be rehired. Papachi didn't encourage him to enter the house, except when she needed something mended or installed.